Okay, we're at the top of the hour. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I am Leslie Burkus, Executive Director of the Urban and Community Forestry Society. Really happy to have you here today. We had a huge response to this one. 230 people registered for this webinar because we know this must be a really important issue to us. A few months ago, we had one from City of Austin talking about tree preservation on private property, and that was a really popular one. And now we know that's one thing to get your ordinance in place. Now, how do you actually enforce it and make sure that people follow the rules? So Joe's going to start talking about that here in just a bit. And just as piece of it, as we know, there's a lot of parts to tree enforcement and tree ordinance enforcement. So we have a lot to cover. This will cover here. And since we had such a great response, I know we'll continue to do this in some series or maybe a panel down the line. So let me get started because I would like to share with you a little bit more about our organization. So many of you are probably members, but if you're not, I want to take a little time to introduce you to Urban and Community Forestry Society, formerly SMA, Society of Municipal Arborists, which I will talk about here in a second. So quickly do an introduction on UCFS, and then we'll hear from Joe. Joe is the Village Forester and Tree Preservation Officer with the Village of Wilmette, Illinois. He's also the Vice President of the Illinois Arborist Association, as well as the host of the Municipal Arborist podcast, which I was fortunate to get to be on here, and you'll get to hear my episode soon, but great podcast to talk about the issues that municipal arborists, urban foresters are dealing with every day. So today he'll talk about the evidence necessary to adjudicate an offense from tree preservation or offenses to your tree preservation ordinances, finding a balance between the offenses and the outcomes because they're not always equal. And then managing your resources, especially your time, because it takes so much to get these processed and you've got a lot on your plate. So how do you manage your resources and your time? And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So notes about today, please drop your name and where you're from in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. It's so great to have so many of you. We have people from across the world as part of this. UCFS is an international membership organization, so great to have you here. Let's see where you're from. This webinar is being recorded and I will be posting it later. So if you want to rewatch or share with colleagues, that will be available to you. ISC CEUs have been approved for this and I will submit those on your behalf. At the end of this presentation, I will drop the form in the chat and you can then go in and fill in your ISA information. So again, I will drop that in the chat at the end of this. Please I have you all on mute, so keep yourself on mute and then we'll bring you off mute at the end so you can ask questions or use the chat at any time. Okay, so the Urban and Community Forestry Society. What do we do? Although our name has changed, our mission remains the same. We are here to build the confidence, competence, and camaraderie of all professionals who manage trees and forests to create and sustain more livable communities. So to break that down even further, we are the professional membership home for the people who make and support daily tree planting and care decisions in communities. So if you've been hired by a city to manage trees, if you work for a private company and you're supporting managers of trees, if you're the state coordinator for urban forestry, you're supporting somebody making a daily tree planting decision, and we welcome you here. Professional associations are there to help lift your voice up, get you a seat at the table, make sure you feel confident in your tree planting and tree care decisions, and that's what our goal is. And this is just one example of how we're trying to help you feel more confident in the tree planting and care decisions you're making. UCFS was founded in 1964, and we are a 501c6 membership-based organization, just tax language to say that we are membership-based. And we are, like I said, an international membership group. And that's largely because of that next bullet point. We are a professional affiliate of the International Society of Arboriculture. So we partner really closely with ISA on lots of different programming, on their municipal specialist certification, many different things that we work with ISA on. And we're a partner in community forestry with Arbor Day Foundation, Alliance for Community Trees, and the Urban Wood Network. All that to say that we're trying to grow the pie. And we know that urban forestry is the thing, is becoming one of those professions that people are going to want to be part of. And we're working with our partners to do that. And UCFS sees the profession growing rapidly, and we want to be there for professionals like you. So here, hello to the new Urban and Community Forestry Society, UCFS. Again, our mission has not changed, but our look has. So you'll see a new logo from us, our new website, and our new YouTube channel that has some of our past recordings on there from the learning series. So if you haven't gone over to the website, please check us out. You're going to see a lot of new and fresh things coming from us over the next year. A new brand relaunch was a big thing to take on, so we're excited to have gotten there, and we're really eager to keep supporting you. That's the main goal, is to support you as members and make sure you feel like you have the information you need to keep doing what you do, growing healthy trees where people live. I just want to take a few minutes to talk about our offerings so that you feel like you know how you could connect with us and how you could take advantage of a membership to UCFS. So we offer our City Trees publication bi-monthly. Hopefully you all know about that. I'm so proud of our publication. Our editor is one of the best, and she makes sure that we have really great information on there in the publication from a technical perspective, as well as just human interest, to learn more about your peers and people doing the work across the world. That is open source. So your membership helps support that and make sure that that publication can keep going. And it also allows you then, since it's open source, to share with your stakeholders or your tree board or maybe your city manager to help them know about the issues you're dealing with. Arborist Exchange, that is another program that we offer. It's up to $2,000 for people to exchange and go learn more about urban forestry practices on the ground. This is a members only opportunity, and applications, well, actually they're due today. So if you wanted to try and get one in, sneak it in under the wire, you certainly could do that. The next round will be due on May 30th. And again, this helps you pay for your travel to go see someone doing urban forestry in another location. Our mentor program is due at the end of December, and this helps us match you with somebody else within urban forestry. So mentoring by its name often means someone with more experience to less experience, and that generally is the way we try and match our mentor programs, but we also try and think of it as peer-to-peer learning as well. Even if you're younger or newer in the industry, you have a lot to share with somebody who's been in the profession for longer, and we could think of this as reverse mentoring as well. So please take advantage of that. It's one thing that we get asked about a lot is how do I, have someone I can talk to and bounce ideas off of. So would love you to take part in that. Applications are due at the end of December. We also offer our Urban and Community Forestry Society accreditation program, for your city. We are taking a little bit of a break and analysis on this. I'm going to drop a survey link in the chat after I come off camera here, because I'd love to get your feedback on if you think it's needed. There's a lot going on with accreditation. And again, this is not for you. This is for your community and your program. We'd love to hear from you and see if you think it's needed, what we could do to improve. So I'll drop that survey here shortly. Our next learning series will be held December 13th at noon Central again. And this will be large-scale tree planting campaigns, lessons from 1 million trees Atlanta. So many communities are setting these big tree planting goals, 1 million trees, 500,000, whatever it might be. They often seem daunting, but we know there's real value in them too from the marketing side of things. But when push comes to shove, how are those trees actually getting planted? How are they getting cared for? How are they getting tracked? So many questions with those large scale tree planting campaigns. So join us to learn from Trees Atlanta, and then Sandy Springs, Georgia, a member of ours from Sandy Springs who's taking part of it. So love to have you there. And finally, if you are a member of UCFS, thank you so much. Your membership dues help make things like this possible, help make the mentorship program possible, brings you together, gets you a seat at the table. We really love having you here, so thank you. If you're not, really hope you'll consider it when the time is right. And with that, Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. I was just telling Leslie how before I have done this presentation before in about 30 or 40 minutes, and I have also completed it in 2 hours. So there's always a lot of questions and a lot of detail to get into here, but I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to be talking about the city of Park Ridge, which was where I previously worked. I'm now working for the village of Wilmette, which has also a comprehensive ordinance However, much different, and I would like to talk about some of those cases as well, but that will be coming at another time. So to put in a scale where Park Ridge is located, it's a northwest suburb of Chicago, Illinois, population of just under 38,000, a little over 7 square miles of land, and 126 miles of roadway that we maintain there. The Forestry Division maintained over 21,000 city-owned trees, and we enforced the tree preservation ordinance through building permit administration and state and local legislation, which allows us to preserve trees on private property. So I'm not really going to talk too much about why we should preserve trees, because I'm pretty sure the audience here is pretty familiar with all of the benefits that trees produce for our urban canopy. So I'll go ahead and skip that, and since we're a little shorter on time. But our municipal code, or my Park Ridge's municipal code, covered everything in the public right-of-way, which includes obviously parkway trees, and it prohibited any kind of planting, pruning, or removals of those trees. And that the public tree ordinance is essentially, it is the backbone of the Tree City USA, or one of the major components of becoming a Tree City USA community. However, we did go a step further and protected trees on private property, which included all trees over 10 inches DBH. And it also mandated the removal of diseased or hazardous trees or tree parts. So that means if a tree on private property is dead, the city will mandate its removal. And it also protects trees from improper pruning, which we'll talk about a little bit through a case study here. The fine structures are broken down as this. Removal of tree without a permit is $500 per diameter inch. Substantial destruction is the same. Not pruning to ANSI standards could be anywhere from $250 to $2,500. If that not pruning to ANSI standards resulted in major damage to the tree, then that would fall under the substantial destruction, and we'll get into a case there soon. And then parkway tree pruning without a permit, anywhere from $50 to $500. Now, the problem with all of these fine structures is, yeah, they seem great on paper, but how can you prove what the diameter of a tree was once the tree is gone, right? How can we prune that, or how can we prove that somebody has actually performed substantial destruction on the tree when all of those tree parts are removed? So we'll talk a little bit about that here moving forward. Under state legislation, we were allowed to be designated as conservators of the peace, which essentially meant we are allowed to enforce local ordinances. And our ordinance was very specific about what our roles were able to enforce. We couldn't go and write tickets for some electrical code violation or something. That would be the responsibility of the electrical inspector, for example. And the code goes even further, which is similar to most ordinances in the United States, where if any person essentially hinders or prevents us from performing our duties, that would be deemed a separate offense. So some enforcement statistics from 2017 through 2021. These are enforcement actions that I had taken personally. I had issued 65 citations during that time period and assessed nearly $65,000 in fines. That's really not something to be proud about, honestly. It's good. The thing to be proud about is that we're actually enforcing an ordinance that is in place. However, what's important to understand is a lot of these times that we have to issue citations is we're issuing citations to, small companies sometimes who just don't know any better. And this obviously large citation would really affect their overhead. And then also private property owners, right? It's hard for people to make it out there, and sometimes they're ignorant of the ordinance. However, ignorance is not a valid excuse according to the law. So basically, just running through here, this is the process of what would happen. Say an infraction takes place, and I'd find out of an infraction if it's a tree removal, for example, without a permit. Typically, a neighbor would call and say, hey, does this person have a permit to remove this tree? And then I would go out and check it out. Or I'm just driving by doing other things and happen to see something taking place that should not be taking place. But once I've noticed the infraction, we investigate by visiting the site, speaking with all parties involved, and gathering evidence. Now, per our ordinance and many ordinances in Illinois at least, both the property owner and the contractor, the person performing the work, are liable. So then that leads us to, we're going to determine who is likely at fault. Will a warning suffice if it's a smaller infraction? Let's say someone's tree protection fence at a site development has been moved or removed by a subcontractor, but no damage has taken place. Maybe a warning will suffice. But obviously, if a tree has been removed, then they're going to get a citation. And then we're going to document that evidence and all of the parties involved. If we determine that we are going to issue a citation, we need to determine who the property owner is at the time, and we do that by checking the county website. And then we're going to issue the citation. We're going to make sure everything is filled out properly and that all parties involved actually have the citation in hand. And they're going to send the documentation to the police department for their purposes. Now, the adjudication process it's probably different in each state and obviously in each country. But in Illinois, if you're a community of a certain size, you can become a home rule community, which allows you to adjudicate certain offenses at the municipal level without having to go to Cook County or to the county circuit court. So adjudication is essentially municipal court. So the adjudication process prior to the actual adjudication is we would meet with the city prosecutor to discuss the details of the case and determine a possible settlement. Typically, we're looking for a settlement. We're not looking to be heavy-handed with everything. And we're going to get into the details of that. And then there's a judge who acts as the adjudication judge. And the adjudication judge is a third-party attorney who will determine liability and review any evidence that we have. He'll approve any agreements that the respondent has made with the city. And then if there are no agreements and we have to go to trial, he will oversee the trial hearings and make a determination. And then he makes the final judgment and any other orders that are necessary and associated with that case. So that is where most of the work is involved, is over here in the adjudication side. Some of the investigation tools, they're all very common, D-tape, a measuring wheel, tape measure, caliper measuring tool, and cell phone, obviously for taking pictures. There's also use of GIS technology, which you can use to measure or determine infrastructure or other types of things. Of course, plat of survey comes in handy for, depending on where the tree's location is on the property, would determine if the tree would have or would not have been permitted to be removed anyway. So we need to scale plat sometimes to make those measurements and determinations. We use Google Maps a lot. The most obvious reason would be to see that there was a tree there in 2018. In 2019, a tree is gone, but I'll show you a pretty unique way that we used it in a case study moving forward here. And then also Google Street View, which same reason as the last one. Then, of course, tree inventory software. So the city had up-to-date inventory, which was broken into 6 zones. Every year we updated a new zone in anticipation of our cycle prune, so we can get a proper idea of what the costs are going to be for that year. But this will tell us condition of a tree at the time that it was inventoried and the size, etc. So we'll move on to the citation part. This is pretty straightforward. It's just who, what, where, and when, right? So this is not a real citation. This is just an example that I had written up, but you would want the name, the address, where they live. If any other, you need to write what the code violation was, the offense committed. You can write where it says in that describe actions. You can see here I wrote removed a 24-inch white oak without a permit. The time that it occurred, And then on the lower right hand of the screen, you'll see that it actually says you must appear at a hearing, and then it gives you the date and the time. Now, if we are issuing a citation for a tree removal without a permit such as this, we actually could just write them a fine amount for 24 times $500 per inch and hope that they pay it, but we know they're not going to pay it and they're going to request a hearing anyway. So we just skip that process and bring them right to the hearing. And this is an example of a ticket that we would write with a fine. So in this example, you can see I wrote parkway fence not installed and maintained. And in this example, again, this is not a real citation, we would issue on the very bottom, you'll see a $250 fine. And it doesn't matter if the defendant signs it or not, they are still responsible for any infraction that has taken place. Same thing with like a speeding ticket or something. So let's move on to some examples. This is the meat and potatoes of this whole presentation. And what I really like to talk about again is that everything, even though the ordinance is black and white, the real world examples are not. Working through these are very, very difficult. It's not as simple as one would hope for. So in this example, someone has installed an electrical outlet to a parkway tree, which is not permitted. Again, this is located in the parkway or the right-of-way, and it's a city-owned tree, and there's damage that has taken place. They've also installed some lights on the left and right side of this tree and connected them with electrical wire. This is an offense that we just want to seek compliance because this is a minor violation. So we knock on the door and first see if we can speak with them. In this instance, they were not home, so I sent them an official letter giving them a deadline to remove the materials from the parkway and the tree, which they did. So that's a pretty straightforward one. We could have issued a citation, but not really necessary. And then also, the thing that's important to understand is, yes, I can issue a citation for an offense like this. However, if we issued a citation with a fine amount and then they requested an adjudication hearing and then they requested a trial with the judge, I can prove with this picture that there's an item has been attached to the tree which is not allowed, and that there's items installed in the parkway which are not allowed. However, it would be difficult to articulate that substantial damage has occurred, and the ticket would likely be dismissed by the judge, in my experience. But obviously you have to weigh what the damage is to determine if you're going to give a warning or a citation. This is another example of a minor violation where a builder has installed a lockbox to a parkway tree. This is another picture of it, and I just use this as an example of gathering the evidence. You can see on the right side, you see the tree trunk with the box installed, and then the address of the property. So if I need to prove something, I can say, look, this picture was taken actually at this location. Seems kind of mundane and obvious, but the devil's in the details, as they say. This is an example. First, a little bit of background information. During construction projects, the ordinance requires that the parkway or right-of-way be completely fenced, whether there's a tree present or not. So that's the first violation here, is there is not parkway tree protection fence installed in this parkway. A second violation is you're not permitted to cross over the parkway with equipment or materials or anything like that, and site access must only take place either at the existing driveway through an alley or a pre-approved location as approved by us, the foresters. In this instance, I caught this lift doing some work on the side of this house, and you can clearly see that there's pretty significant soil compaction that has took place, which they tried to mitigate through putting some boards and plywood down. They did initially receive a warning, and then I caught them again, and then this person was actually cited. I don't have the details of what the fine amounts were for this one, but they were cited. They were given a specific fine amount to pay by a certain date. They did not pay it. They requested an adjudication hearing. It went to trial, and the city won, and the defendant had to, or the respondent had to pay the fine amount. So this is a little bit more of a serious one. This is kind of a common one. Sometimes code enforcement officials deal with this. In Park Ridge, it was up to the foresters. This is vegetation growing into the right-of-way. Again, something like this, we're just kind of looking for compliance. You know, we send them a letter, tell them you have X amount of days to prune this back. Obviously, this is a lot of vegetation growing into the sidewalk or right-of-way. This is a very similar example where this is a maintained vegetation. However, if you look more closely, it does only look about 6 inches, growing 6 inches over the sidewalk at the sidewalk itself, at the concrete. But if you look up at the top here, you can see that if you're an adult human, that would be impeding access to the right of way. So again, we're just looking for compliance. Now, in something like this, if compliance does not occur, then we do two things depending on the scenario. So in a lot of cases, we would just issue a citation and then still make them do it. However, if they don't respond to that, and a citation in an instance like this too is a per day violation. So if it's $50 per day times 45 days, the fines can get high pretty quick. But what we can also do is send our public works crew out to prune this themselves, and then we can issue a citation for per day, and then we can also seek money for the cost incurred for the village or the city to do the work for the resident. Moving into some more serious offenses, this tree is located in the right-of-way or parkway, or however you would like to define it. And as you can see, the tree has been completely topped. So the possible fines that this respondent would be facing is $4,000 plus removal costs plus replanting costs. Now, $4,000 again is determined by the inch of tree that has been damaged or removed. In this case, since it's a parkway tree, we knew it was 8 inches times 500 gives you $4,000. The settlement was only $600, which broke down to $75 a diameter inch. So in this instance, this was a tree that was planted by the property owner. He had brought it back from Europe or something, and I actually don't even know what kind of tree it was. So he planted it himself. The city had not planted it or maintained it. So there was a little bit of leeway from the city prosecutor on this one. So $600, he gets it. Now he knows he can't touch the trees in the parkway. He talks to his neighbors about it. Maybe he's mad at the city, but now everyone around him knows that is not something that is acceptable per our ordinance. So the removal of trees on private property is prohibited. Any person who removes or substantially destroys a tree without a city permit is in violation of Section 1518.3 and shall be fined a minimum of $500 per diameter inch. That's exactly what the code reads. What is a protected tree? Basically, it's any tree that is 10-inch DBH or larger, or any multi-stem tree having a cumulative diameter of 15 inches or more, or any tree of any size that was required to be planted by ordinance or any agreement with the village. So when will we issue a permit to remove a tree on private property? If the tree is dead, dying, diseased, or within the buffer zone. We're going to talk about the buffer zone a little bit here. If the tree is in decline and likely to die within 3 years. That is a very vague statement, and that's how the ordinance is written. So if I don't believe the tree is going to die within 3 years, then I don't issue the permit. If the tree is clearly dying or declining in health substantially, then we issue the permit. If the tree is determined to be at risk. Now, at risk is another obscure kind of definition that the ordinance has, but essentially it's at risk of like structural failure, something like that. So picture Norway maple with codominant stem and included bark and evidence of decay, etc. That could be qualified as an at-risk tree. If the tree falls within a footprint of a proposed new building, so if someone applies for a permit to demo and build a new home, and that new home is going to be where a tree is located, then they would be permitted to remove it. And then also before the permit goes out the door, the contractor doing the work must be licensed with the city and have up-to-date insurance on file with us. So I'm going to talk about what happens when someone is proposing to remove a healthy tree. So this is an example. We have two very stout and healthy looking bur oak trees located on private property. This person wished to remove these trees and applied for a permit, which they would be permitted to do, and I'll explain it. And the way that it works is, so I guess I'll go back here. So these trees are located in what is defined as the buffer zone. So the ordinance defines the buffer zone as the area measured 10 feet away from the primary structure. So if any tree is located within 10 feet of a primary structure and it's healthy, the tree will be permitted to be removed. However, there are replacement requirements associated with that. And the ordinance states that one replacement tree is required for every 10 inches of diameter being removed. So if it's an 11-inch tree, you have to replant one tree back into its place. If it's a 21-inch tree, you have to replant two trees back into its place. Each replacement tree also requires $375 to be placed into an escrow account with the city. And these escrow fees are refunded as long as the tree replacement requirements are met within 1 year. If the trees are not planted, then those funds are transferred to the city's tree bank, where those funds are used to plant new parkway trees. And I like to just take a side note here and tell you that in the village of Wilmette, under their ordinance, which I administer, all of the money that is generated from healthy tree removals is actually reinvested back into private property versus the parkway in this example, which is great. And the way that we do that in Wilmette is through a private property tree planting incentive program, where a resident can apply to participate as long as they're planting a tree back onto their private property. And then we will issue a rebate of up to $500 for them to plant a tree. So that's just two different examples of how a similar thing are handled. So back to this bur oak example, we have one 33-inch bur oak and one 30-inch bur oak. So again, we have that $375 per required replacement tree to be placed into escrow. The total escrow is $1,875. And 5 replacement trees are required there. When I worked in Park Ridge, I used to think that these fees were pretty high, but now in Wilmette, if it's what we define as a heritage tree, these would be inch for inch replacements or $125 per inch fee in lieu, which is substantially higher than this Park Ridge example. Now, if these trees are outside of that buffer zone, the permit would be denied. And the only outcome for those trees to be removed would be if the applicant appealed to city council and then pled their case to city council, and then city council could overturn it. 2020 tree removal permit statistics, 543 tree removal permit applications were reviewed. 21 were denied outright, but it's important to understand that that does not include all denials, because there are some tree removal permits that were applied for or that are applied for where there are several trees that they're proposing to remove. So, for example, they want proposing to remove 2 trees, but we only allow them to remove 1. We issued 49 permits with escrow and planting requirements for a total of just over $40,000 in escrow deposits for that year. And we only issued $3,375 in refunds for that year, which means, unfortunately, that trees are not being planted and they're not getting their money back. Which also tells me that the fee in lieu is far too low. This is an example of a buffer zone project. This is a crudely drawn depiction that I made in Microsoft Paint. You can see there's doors here. That's pretty cool that I put that detail in there for you guys to see. But essentially, this was a single-family new development where a house was demolished and a new house was being proposed to be built. And there's a pool in the backyard. Several other oak trees were already removed to facilitate this project, except there was one more left near where this proposed pool was. And fortunately, the trees were located outside of that buffer zone. Again, that 10-foot buffer zone, which is measured 10 feet from the primary structure. So the builder was upset that he couldn't remove this tree. The new property owners whom the house was being built for were not happy that they were going to have a tree right next to this pool. Furthermore, we weren't going to let them build the pool because there was going to be substantial destruction to the critical root zone of this tree. So what they did is they redesigned this rear patio here and threw in another structural wall that connected to the roof above it, which gave them the 10-foot buffer zone that they needed to remove that what was a healthy oak tree. There are ways for people to get around these things if they're savvy. This is another example of a single-family new development. I was driving by one day and saw this pile of logs in the street, and I thought to myself, what are those doing there? I never approved a permit to remove a tree of that size. And the logs in the background there are just logs. The stump is actually located closest to us. And on their civil drawings, they were proposing to remove a 10-inch, I think it was a blue spruce down here, which they did get a permit issued for. This tree over here on the right side was the tree that was removed without a permit, and it was indicated as a 17-inch tree. It was a Siberian elm. They were looking at possible fines of $8,500. So again, 17 inches times $500 in diameter inch. And we offered a settlement of $2,550 and forced them to replant one tree within 60 days. So again, this is a settlement. This is an offer that the city prosecutor, in conjunction with me, made to the respondent so we don't have to go to trial. And this $150 an inch is kind of what we were landing on a lot. And our thinking was, instead of just getting these large fines, we'd rather get a fine, which is still substantial, as long as we're getting trees planted back onto the property. And again, in this instance, they're removing a less than ideal tree species for the region, Siberian elm. So that's how we landed on that settlement like that. This is a pretty unique example where on the left side of this picture, you'll see that there's a new home going up. And on the right side is another home. So this is a neighbor issue. So the person on the right called me one day and said, hey, the builder cut half of my tree off. And I'm like, well, ma'am, this is a civil issue. You'll have to, deal with it, yourself. You might have to hire an attorney and go after the builder or the property owners, et cetera. And she's like, no, it's really bad. You need to come look. So since we do have that substantial destruction clause in, which I'll detail in a moment, I did go out and take a look, and this is what I found was the half of the tree was removed. So the way that I proved up this case was first I measured the tree, obviously, to determine what the size was, and you can see that half of the tree was clearly removed. Now, what was the condition of that half of the tree? That's what's difficult to prove. The definition of substantial destruction here, well, pruning is basically no healthy. Basically, what this, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically what this says is all trees pruned on private property must be pruned to ANSI standards. However, if any healthy protected tree is subject to substantial destruction, the party doing so shall be deemed to be in violation of another section, which is exactly what the tree removal was. So like I said, it's $500 diameter inch for substantial destruction. And the definition of substantial destruction, this is important, is the pruning out of more than 35% of live branches of a tree, or any activity that in the opinion of the forester is likely to result in the death of a tree or place it into an at-risk category, which is what happened here. So the way that we proved this up was we looked at what Google had for us for the year prior. So this pin on the left is the house of the person, or this is the property where the tree is located, and the house on the right, this is the property where the construction is taking place. And if you draw a line straight up between those properties, everything from the right had been removed. This is just another view showing the size of the canopy of that tree, which was in the front, which was a honey locust. There was another tree further back on the property, which was not affected. So I issued a citation, took them to adjudication. They were looking at $13,000 in potential fines, and they settled for $3,900, which again, $150 an inch, and that they also agreed to replant 2 trees back onto their property meaning the property where the construction was taking place. And they did work separately with the property owner where the tree was located and came to their own private settlement with that as well. But this is a very unique situation where we actually did become involved with a private civil matter because per our ordinance, they were in violation. This is a really good example of someone who just didn't care and thought that they would be okay. So you can see if you look close, that tree has been girdled by what I imagine is a very dull chainsaw operated by a human who does not know much about chainsaw operation. This property owner applied for a tree removal permit. The tree removal permit was denied because the tree was healthy. Several weeks or months later, I was driving in the neighborhood and noticed a black line on this tree, which he tried to cover up the girdling that took place. Here's a couple more pictures showing the health and size of this tree. Take note of the house on the right, which is his neighbor. So we did issue citation and bring him to adjudication. He was facing $13,500. It was a 27-inch tree. We offered a settlement. He didn't take it. It went to trial. I believe there was a continuation before it went to trial. He did have a lawyer, and we won the case. Of course, we won the case. He applied for the permit. Clearly, he damaged the tree to try to kill it because he was upset that we didn't give him the permit. So obviously, it's a pretty clean-cut case, right? Great, we won. But what did the city win? $1,000 fine only for damaging that tree like that. But the judge left the door open for us to cite again if the tree dies, which, if you know anything about law in the United States, you can't really do because it's called double jeopardy. You can't be charged twice for the same crime. Be that as it may, we're all confused. How could this have happened? To make matters worse, they appealed to Cook County Circuit Court. So per legislation in Illinois, if you're a home rule community who does have your own in-house adjudication process, the respondent has 35 days to file an appeal to the Cook County Circuit Court, where a judge in the county will review the case. He won't look at the details of the case, or they won't look at the details of the case to determine if damage actually took place to that tree and if the fine amount was appropriate. What they're actually looking at is making sure that the legal process that took place through the adjudication process was sound. But the city did not want to pay our third-party attorney fees to fight it in court, so we as the city, not we as foresters, made an agreement with the property owner to pay that $1,000 fine within 10 days and then plant 2 trees back onto the property within 60 days. And then we approved the permit to remove the tree. It's not a very good outcome. However, if we would have fought it, we potentially could have lost. But this is where internal politics come into play and do not always come out on top for the trees, unfortunately. And then we also agreed to not issue any further citations for that particular tree. Why would we? They're removing the tree now. Not impressive. Here's an example of a large oak tree that we found and actually in the process of being removed, we found this and measured about 32 inches. Now, we did this a lot because if we don't have the actual DBH of the tree is gone. So we typically don't have the DBH of the tree. We'll usually measure the stump or whatever logs, if there are logs around, and use that as our basis for any fine amounts. So this one is about 32 inches, very large. They were facing $16,000 in possible fines. In this case, well, actually in all these cases, I should note that, and I mentioned earlier that both the property owner and the parties performing the work are both liable. So in all these other cases I showed you, the contractor also did get fined in a lot of these other instances. Typically it's all variable. But in this instance, this particular contractor was kind of like a fly-by-night from out of town, and they gave us a really difficult time. But unfortunately, there was a settlement made with the property owner for $1,000 even though they removed a 32-inch healthy oak tree, and they had to replant one tree back onto the property within 60 days. However, the adjudication for the contractor, again, they're looking at the same fine amount, $16,000. It didn't work out very well for them because they did not show up to their adjudication hearing. And per the ordinance and state law, we were awarded the default judgment of $16,000. So I'm not actually sure what happened, if they ended up paying that or not, because again, they were fly by night from out of town. But this is an example of somebody who did get hit pretty hard. Here's an example of a tree here where the gentleman who owned this property adjacent to our parkway called me one day and he said, "Hey, I need you to come out to look at my tree." When I'm okay, what's wrong with it? And he said that he planted some flowers and he was worried that he damaged the root system. So I'm like, okay. So I put in a ticket to go look at the tree, and I'll look at it soon. This is not an emergency. Just planted some flowers and he's worried about his tree. Great. He called back again and then came back into City Hall to express the urgency of this matter. And what had actually happened was he had taken a chainsaw to the roots of this tree to plant these flowers. Now, I'll tell you that anecdotally, what I actually think happened was he was trying to kill this tree, realized the error in his ways, and then put the flowers in the ground to try to cover it up. So we hired a contractor to perform air excavation of the tree, and this is what we found. Substantial destruction to the root system of this tree. He didn't even cut these roots in a manner that would leave room for him to plant flowers. So be that as it may, an anecdotal argument, doesn't fly when you're in a trial. So you just have to show the evidence. So this is the evidence that we have. He actually admitted, obviously, to doing this. So that's pretty good. We have these photos of the damage that took place. So we already know that substantial destruction took place, but then also under the right-of-way portion of our code, it states that no person shall willfully injure, deface, disfigure, cut, or carve basically any tree located in the parkway, which is what had happened here. So he's facing about $7,700 in fines. So the tree removal for our contractor, because we had to remove this tree now, was $178. Stump removal and site restoration, $91, $150 for the contractor for the root collar excavation. Approximate cost for a new tree per our contract was $240, plus that fine amount of $500 times 14 inches came to $7,000. He hired an attorney. They did not wish to settle, so we did go to trial. We won. The judge ordered a $3,659 fine. And that is all that I have for you for case examples in the city of Park Ridge for that time frame.
Well, thanks, Joe. I actually think maybe we should have also made this a therapy session and should have had a counselor on staff for this, because I know it's so frustrating with this, because you put your ordinances in place, you have your evidence behind you, and then those fines. Oh my gosh, how frustrating that is. Maybe as I start asking questions, how do you deal with that? The frustration of not being able to get what you wanted out of it.
For me personally, I kind of look at it just like I do any other decision that gets made above my head, right? We're hired as professionals to do a specific job, and we can only do the best job that we can, and we should always strive for that. And sometimes decisions get made that you have no control over. So instead of getting frustrated by it, I just, again, do the best that I can and then move on to the next one.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Joe. If you've got questions, we've got about 10 minutes left, so drop them in the chat. And then in a second here, I'll also bring everyone off mute so you could raise your hand and ask a question. One question came in through the chat. Does the city catalog those aerial images that you are using?
Well, yes, we do. So in our GIS software, the county the county does flyover data every couple years, and they take photos from an airplane, and then all that's uploaded into the GIS software. So we can go year by year by year, all the way back to like the early 2000s, and look at a history. Now the quality of those photos are very variable, but we do have several years of data for those photos, and those are typically taken during the winter. And the reason for that is so you can see through the canopy and see actually what's below there. But those are very useful photos.
Okay. It looks like there's some chat here about different aerial images as well, so you can check in that. Somebody asked about the replacement trees. Do you go back and check that they were actually planted and that they remain? Because what's to keep them from removing the tree again?
Yeah, so this comes up a lot in a lot of presentations that I do. And yes, we do an inspection to ensure that the tree was planted and that the tree was from the approved species list and was the right size and that it was healthy. After that, there is no follow-up. Now, again, what's important to understand about this is what can I prove, right? There's nothing in the ordinance that says that the tree has to remain healthy for a certain amount of time. It just says that the tree has to be planted back onto the private property. So let's say I come back in 3 years and the tree is gone and the homeowner says the tree died, but I have an inkling that they just removed it because they didn't want it. I have no way to prove that. And going through the trials so many times, the adjudication trials, it's not a winnable case for me. Or the village or the city or whoever it is. So yeah, there is no real follow-up after that. The follow-up is that the tree is a protected tree. So in the best case scenario, the tree gets planted, several years go by, new property owner buys the house and wants to demo it and build a new house. If they're proposing to remove that tree, now they fall under the same requirements as removing another protected tree, even though the tree is only 3 inches, let's say.
Okay. We had a couple of people ask about staffing. So someone asked how big your department is, how many people do the inspections, and then someone asked about how many people are hired to be able to do this.
So in Park Ridge, it was just 2 of us, the city forester, and I worked under him as the urban forester. So we split duties, which made things easier. In the village of Wilmette, we have 3 village foresters. 2 of them work in public works and handle all the maintenance of the trees located in the right-of-way and parkway. And then I work in community development, and my entire job is just devoted to the enforcement of the ordinance.
Okay. And that might actually help with another question. Any advice on getting code enforcement staff support in enforcing tree code violations when they don't seem to see tree violations as worth their time?
Can you repeat that? I was reading something that
Yeah.
one of the questions that popped up too.
Having the code enforcement staff help.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in Park Ridge and Wilmette, there was code enforcement involved in in everything else. And we were devoted to just the tree issues, which is helpful because we're also tree professionals. I hope I'm answering that question right.
Well, I think they would like their code enforcement staff to be more interested in if they see a violation, letting you know, or maybe issuing fines if they're trained on, I don't know, but having code enforcement more interested.
That's an interesting one. It's a very slippery slope, I would say. In my opinion, I think you should have a professional arborist on staff who is just dealing with all of your tree enforcement issues. And then if that's the case, you need to train other code enforcement officials on what the threshold is for information that you want to know about. For example, we had a part-time code enforcement officer, super fresh off the streets. And he was constantly sending me to all these sites for trees that were non-issues or that they already had permits for. So that kind of ended up clogging up my work days because I was getting overwhelmed by somebody with no experience who was trying to do the right thing. However, it was keeping me away from the things that were actually important to keep going. So completely innocent, but it did create another issue.
Yeah. Andrew asked that question, then William responded to it with their work in Atlanta, or sorry, outside of Atlanta in Georgia, trying to trade code enforcement and then educating them as well, like you're saying. So sounds like, again, this I think will be a first part and a multi-part of enforcement, and because it's so such on top of all of our minds, so we can keep talking that through. So Becky asked, do you have a stop work order authority?
Yes, both in Park Ridge and Wilmette, and I have used them multiple times. That's something that you have to really be careful when you use it. It's one of the many tools that we have available. Typically, what I will do is most offenses don't require a stop work unless it's a tree removal without a permit or they're substantially destroying a tree through, poor pruning practices. But let's say it's a construction site who, again, I'll use that tree protection fence as an example. Portion of the property, tree protection fence is down, but no damage has occurred. So that is, you have 24 hours to get into compliance. And now if they're not in compliance, then I could issue a citation if I want, or I can do a stop work order until they get it fixed, or I can issue a citation and do a stop work order. It just really depends on how far into non-compliance they are.
Mhm. I'll keep reading questions off of chat. If you would like to come off mute and ask your own question or share some thoughts, feel free to raise your hand and we can do it that way too. Dylan asks, what kind of outreach is provided to the public and private stakeholders, tree managers, about the tree ordinance and enforcement consequences? So how do you let people know that this is a possibility for them?
So I'll give the Wilmette as the example. When I started there, the ordinance was brand new, and they hired me just to get this new ordinance off the ground and running. And the first thing that I did was, ran a search in our permitting software to find out who all of the tree contractors were who were working in town. Notified all of them via letter, email of all the new changes in the ordinance, and then I'm continually doing that throughout any kind of change that comes through. And then also with the tree contractors and the builders, I did a kind of presentation / workshop at Village Hall where I walked them through what the regulations and ordinance requirements were, and then allowed them the opportunity to ask questions. And then furthermore, what I like to do is try to get ahead of things. So through the building review process, I become friendly with a lot of the builders who do a lot of work in town. And what I'll do now is they know to contact, when they buy a new property, they know contact me, and I'll go out there and I'll walk the site with them and tell them what's going to be a problem, what's not going to be a problem, and help work through some of those issues before the design process starts. Now, a lot of times the design process starts before we've had an opportunity to do that, but it just helps further build relationships and then educate them on what we're looking for, and is actually a pretty seamless process in my opinion.
Thanks, Joe. I just dropped the ISACU form in the chat. We're approaching the top of the hour. Joe and I chatted ahead of time. We'll stay on after 1 p.m. Central Time where we are. So if you can stay on, feel free. Otherwise, the CEU form is in the chat. So if you were seeking ISACUs, please fill that out. I'm going to keep asking some questions here. So we saw this a couple times because I can't remember. Somebody said, why do they use chainsaws? Why don't they just try and kill it with chemicals? It hides that's the damage. And then people went on to say, don't say that out loud. And then also asked if you do any soil tests, if there's any sort of chemical damage to trees. Have you seen that?
So I've never done that, but we absolutely have the ability to do that. And again, that's something where if we did it, luckily we have a budget to do that. So that's not terribly expensive at all. And then if we did that, we would try to charge that back to them through the adjudication process.
Okay. Let's see. How do you handle residents who cannot pay to have a tree removed? Oh, this kind of sounds, yeah.
Yeah, so we don't have any kind of anything in place to any kind of assistance in place for that. That kind of comes up sometimes with some of the lower income residents when you're mandating a removal of a tree. And it's a very sensitive topic. And, I try to just provide more leeway to them during giving them the deadlines to get the work done, because, try to be flexible with their financial situation, but we don't offer any kind of assistance, neither in Wilmette nor Park Ridge.
Okay. Again, we're getting close to the top of the hour. Thanks for joining us. We'll stay on. If you are a member, thanks so much for being a member. If you're not, hopefully you'll consider joining us soon. Joe, a couple of questions here about fees. So somebody asked, let's see, let me get back up here. How was the number chosen at $500 per inch?
So that number came from a lot of community involvement. When that ordinance went into place in Park Ridge prior to my arrival. And that was something that they went from the city and all the advocacy groups working back and forth to land on whatever that number was. Now, I'll use Wilmette as another example. That heritage tree removal is $125 per diameter inch if they're removing a tree and they're paying a fee in lieu instead of doing an inch for inch tree replacement. However, if they remove a tree without a permit, the maximum penalty is only $7,500. So in Wilmette's instance, the replacement requirements are much higher. However, the potential requirements if they remove a tree without a permit are much lower. But again, in both of those cases, they looked at other ordinances across the country and locally and worked with the community and all the stakeholders to kind of land on a number that everyone sort of agreed on. So, there's parties that want the fine to be $1,000 an inch, and then there's others that don't want to fine at all, or $50 an inch. So they just came to an agreement based on that.
Yeah. I hope that answers your question, Peter. Peter asked it, and then said he was challenged in his town for a caliper fee. Okay.
Challenged.
Yeah, Peter, you can say more if you, or raise your hand, come off mute if you're still on. Okay,
yeah,
go ahead. Yeah.
I was just challenged with that. Actually, I'm up in Canada, so we came up with a $50 per centimeter fee, and I had to come up with a reason why we came up with it, and it was sort of based off a wholesale value of the tree. Right, it was $250, and then it's a 5 centimeter tree, so it was able to be verified somehow. That's all I was kind of wondering. Yeah,
I see. Yep. Yeah, I'm not sure again exactly how they landed on those numbers.
Let's see. Does your police department or legal team play any role in the citation process?
In Park Ridge, the police, if they encountered something, if somebody called the police, then the police would just call us to go out and deal with it. And we were able to issue citations without discussion with anybody, just like a police officer would. We have discretion to either enforce or not enforce or issue citations. In Wilmette, I work very closely with the assistant village manager / corporation counsel on a lot of these cases prior to even issuing a citation. And in Wilmette, it's the same thing. We're issuing a citation with an order to appear at adjudication, and then we try to work on an agreement with the respondent prior to them even coming. So we want to try to have an agreement in place before they even show up for the adjudication.
Okay.
And actually, we've gone through a couple cases now where we're actually offering them settlement by a certain date with a warning: if you don't take this settlement, then we will take you to Cook County Circuit Court and sue you. So that's actually kind of been a little bit easier, because with some of these larger fine amounts, again, if you go to the adjudication process, issue a large fine, they have the ability to take you back to circuit court anyways to appeal it. So with some of these larger fines, sometimes it's easier just to offer a settlement prior to even going through the adjudication process. It just kind of helps speed things up a little bit potentially.
I just dropped that CEU link in the chat again for you. Okay. The recording, I'm just gonna do a little processing and then hope to get it up sometime next week, Ralph. Let's see. You still doing okay on questions, Joe?
Oh yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
Yeah. So it sounds like a few people think some of your fees are a little low, so maybe you have comments on that, or curious maybe if you've had conversations about increasing them. Are your tree removals really only $175? And your replacement tree is about the same? This person's costs are much more. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what they're referring to, but if they're talking about the example of the honey locust tree where the roots were cut and the replanting fee was $240, that $240 replanting fee was based on a 5-year contract that we had with a local nursery to plant, I believe, 3,000 trees during that time. So we had very low cost for planting 2 to 3 inch caliper trees. So that's how that was determined. Now that fee, that $375 fee in lieu, or I'm sorry, escrow fee that had to be paid per replacement tree, I think that is very low. And I think that that cost was determined by what the approximate cost of planting a tree was at the time that the ordinance was put into place, 15 years ago. In my experience in Wilmette on the North Shore of Chicago, for a property owner to plant a 2.5-inch caliper tree by a contractor, it's going to cost them anywhere from, $650 up to $1,300 for someone to come and plant that.
Okay. Someone did ask about that escrow amount too, thinking it seems low.
It is low. That is something that the city of Park Ridge should look at amending.
Okay. How are you going to handle that?
Well, I'm not in Park Ridge anymore, luckily, so I don't have
sorry.
to
Okay,
worry about that.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say we just went through an amendment process in Wilmette almost a year after the ordinance went into place. It was re-reviewed through committee, and a couple of amendments were proposed by me when they all were approved. So, but that was another example where we worked with the community and the stakeholders and let them know, hey, this ordinance has been in place. It's working great. Here's some things that we found are not working so great, and some other things we found that can make everything work better and more equitable. And we proposed the amendments, and the village board unanimously passed them. So we're hoping to do that again sometime next year for some other smaller issues that we found.
Let's see. So we're Pete, you can feel free to come off mute.
Hi, can you hear me, Joe?
Yep.
Yep.
Hey, there are some questions in the Q&A section, and one of the ones I posted really had to do with sort of the pruning damage that can happen, whether it's on a public tree or a private tree, especially practices like lion's tailing, which is now specifically not approved in the ANSI standard. How would you have gone about enforcing what could be viewed as a subjective standard?
That's a really good question, and it's a difficult answer, unfortunately. I think if it was a parkway tree, it's a lot easier for us to issue a citation, and we don't have to prove any ANSI standard or any particular damage, because the fact is, for the parkway, you cannot touch the parkway tree regardless of anything. So that's a pretty clear-cut case. Now, for private property, it gets a lot more murky, because the property owner could argue that, well, the material that was removed was dead, right? Or dying. And I really don't have any way to prove that unless I saw them doing it and had pictures or something that they were actually removing live vegetation. So typically the only time we would really get into the ANSI standards was once it breached that substantial destruction threshold, where clearly significant damage has taken place due to improper pruning or some other, method of damage that had occurred to the tree. Because again, it's not, it's some famous quote from a movie, or something. It's like, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. I don't know if that's from like Devil's Advocate or something, but that really comes into play with all this code enforcement stuff. Is it doesn't matter what I know or what I think, it's what I can prove, through trial, if I have to go to trial. And with something like lion's tailing, that's a real difficult one.
Okay, thank you.
It's a very good question. Thanks.
Well, I think we should probably wrap up, Joe. There are so many questions. I'm really going to note all these truly because I can tell, like I've said many times here, this is a really important issue and it's really critical to our members and the work you're doing every day. So let me look through those and I'll talk with Joe. I'll talk with some of the other folks on our team and in our community. If you have a story you'd like to share, please reach out to me, respond to that email I sent, and let's keep this conversation going because it's really, really important. Joe just dropped his email in the chat and also follow up with that as well in the email out to you all. So thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. Thanks for your time. Sounds like it was really good. People had a lot of questions and we have a lot to learn here and keep doing better, but you've got a good perspective on it. Appreciate your time.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great one.